Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a chemical engineer, so GIS was new to me. I got into it last summer with this project, which I'm going to present on today. I worked with the Coastal Community Initiative at NC State in our pilot program, working to fill in gaps in coastal community resilience. And I've stayed on with my mentor, Dr. Georgina Sanchez, and I now do research in population dynamics and modeling in the U.S. Caribbean. Wanted to present on that today, but the research was not quite ready, but I'm very happy to share what I learned last summer in Jones County, North Carolina. So as I mentioned, this is part of the Coastal Community Resilience Initiative training. We were funded by AmeriCorps, North Carolina Conservation Corps, and NC State University, and we were working as volunteers to serve a coastal county. I got to work with 5 other undergraduate students, and our goal was to deliver a risk and vulnerability assessment. We also wanted to provide GIS resources for future applications. So we provided an online story map that community members could access, as well as local government. And then we also had a fully downloadable GIS database that was ready to be updated and used. We were following the guidance of the RCCP handbook, that is the Resilient Coastal Communities Handbook, and they work with the coastal counties designated by the Coastal Area Management Act. And we were working with Jones County, which is right cut out of that county. They still have all the same effects of flooding and vulnerability to hurricanes, but they don't have the same resources and funding. So we were stepping in to serve them and give them similar resources. In our 10 weeks, we could only be able to do phase 1 of the program, which is community engagement and providing a risk and vulnerability assessment, but this would allow them to be able to apply for grants in the future and gives them that first base of saying this is why we need some funding, and we're hoping to get them some projects in the future. So our approach was to review existing documents. We're looking at other requests for funding they had either asked for or received in the past. We're looking at land use and some existing problems in Jones County. We developed a community engagement strategy. We wanted to check the GIS data that we had, see what was missing and fill in some gaps. So we went there to survey community members and meet with local government. And then we created a GIS database, mapped those critical assets and natural infrastructure and socially vulnerable populations. And then finally we did the report. So we met with government officials from health services, agriculture, fish and wildlife, emergency services was a big one for us. We even got to attend a hurricane readiness exercise between emergency services and NOAA, so that gave us great insights into how the community responds to a hurricane event 96 hours out, and we get to see where those vulnerabilities might come into play. We also surveyed residents. We did this at a local lunch spot and a nonprofit organization that provides food and necessary goods to people in need. So we get to survey people right where they were at. And we were asking what are the most important community assets and what are the most threatening environmental hazards in Jones County. We found that schools and public safety and emergency services were the most important, the most valued in the community, and then of course hurricanes and flooding were the most threatening. And so with this data we decided to focus specifically on our risk and vulnerability assessment on flooding. Here were some assets that we quantified. I wanted to just highlight that there are only 4 public schools in Jones County. This is the 4th largest county in North Carolina by land area, and so those are not very well spread out, and 3 are elementary schools. There's only 1 middle and high school that's combined. And then also the fire and EMS stations and police. There are 19 service locations for the whole county, and all fire are volunteer and all but 1 EMS are volunteer. Also, Jones County is a highly agricultural county. They have a lot of swine production there, and so that land is very important. Following the RCCP handbook, the next steps were to create a vulnerability equation in which we take into account exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. This is just used to rank each asset on how vulnerable it is, and it can be used to prioritize which projects the community would want to complete first. Those are more relevant to the next steps of the RCCP handbook that we didn't get to. But here to explain what each of these things mean. Exposure is how much an asset or population would come into contact with a hazard. So for this example, a house that is nearby a river that might be in the floodplain and not elevated is the most exposed, rather than a house that might be elevated or further away. Sensitivity is how likely to be affected by a hazard when it comes into contact a asset or population is. So an example for this would be a newly built house with fresh materials and modern technology would be far less sensitive than a mobile home or an older home that might be susceptible to leaks from a roof or an unstable foundation. And lastly, adaptive capacity is the ability of a resource or community to bounce back when they come into contact with a hazard. So this might be how strong their local economy is. It could be existing organizations that are in place to help recover, or just access to internet. So now I'll move into some of the GIS stuff that we did, especially in regards to flooding. And the most important thing to understand is that floodplains are meant to flood. That is like their niche in an ecosystem. But a lot of people like to be near rivers and areas that flood because of the natural assets that they provide. And thus there's a lot of misunderstanding because people want to live there and people want to develop. And so we have these legal names like the 100-year floodplain. Most people think that means, especially in Jones County when we were surveying, they thought it meant that something would flood once every 100 years. What this actually means is that there's a 1% annual chance of flooding, and that over a 30-year mortgage, that's a 26% chance of flooding and having damage to your home. So this rating is a little bit misleading. But to overcome that, we wanted to really be conservative in our exposure calculations, and so we used a 250-meter buffer to the floodplain because in reality, the flood doesn't just stop at 1 meter to the next, and there are houses in this area and buildings that might not have flood insurance, might not be elevated, so we wanted to include them in the exposure. You can imagine this as about 3 football fields or a few city blocks. And so we use that to quantify our exposure. So some things I wanted to highlight on this page was that 32% of those fire and EMS stations are in the 250-meter flood zone. In emergency situations, when they already have a lot of volunteer and very few stations for the whole county, having a third of this be vulnerable to flooding is very significant. Same thing with their productive land. As a county that relies on that as an economical driver, having almost 40% be vulnerable to floods is very important. And same with those schools. All of those 4 schools serve as emergency shelters during hurricanes, and so having 2 of them be vulnerable to flooding is very negative and something they should take into consideration when updating infrastructure. Here is a visual of addresses that are within that 250 or that are within the floodplain. This is not a crazy high percentage, but when we look at addresses that are within that 250-meter buffer, you can see how concentrated it is. This is almost a third of all buildings in Jones County that are within that 250-meter buffer and especially vulnerable to flooding. When we were looking at road flooding, this is very important during flooding because people need to evacuate. We looked at it a little bit differently. We were looking at historical flood extents from Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew. This provided us a little bit better insight because we were using satellite imagery. This is from USGS, and it used the satellite imagery so you could see what was actually covered by water, and this gave us a little bit better understanding of how roads were actually covered by water, or if they were elevated, or maybe there was a bridge. So you can see that a very significant portion of land outside of the floodplain was flooded during those big hurricanes. Here are all the roads in Jones County, and here's how much was exposed to flooding during Florence. Even though 122 miles may not seem like much for a big county, you can see the flooding around the 2 town centers. People might need to be evacuating from there. That also makes emergency services less able to get into areas where people might need assistance, which may just call for extra resources like boats, but during a hurricane, many other counties will need to be using this. So this analysis could be good for emergency services to be able to map other routes around these vulnerable areas. We also talked about social vulnerability a lot this summer. Jones County had a vulnerability score of 0.55, which puts it in that medium to high range. The social vulnerability is from the CDC, and it takes into account income, race and minority status, housing and transportation. For Jones County, it's significantly socioeconomic status that gives it this higher vulnerability score. And returning to the vulnerability equation, I will show you how we ranked each of these assets. So for exposure, we were looking at the percent of assets within the floodplain and the buffer zone, as I was talking about. We kept these percents pretty low. A score of 1 is going to be less than or equal to 10, and 2 is 11 to 50. That might seem a little bit counterintuitive for how tight of a, or how large of an area that is to put in 2. But as I was talking about with roads, that even a small percent of roads could lead to extreme vulnerability. So we kept that gap pretty wide open for them. For sensitivity, we were looking at the percent of assets impacted by flooding during Hurricanes Matthew and Florence using those historical flood maps. And we have the same numerical ratings. And then for adaptive capacity, we met with county leaders to individually determine the adaptive capacity scores for each assets. We figured they would know better, especially in their specific areas, and that led us to create this table. The highest possible vulnerability score that could be earned is a 6, and the lowest is a 0. So overall, Jones County was looking not so bad, besides their government offices, which did tend to be built in that 250-meter buffer zone, which made them a little bit more vulnerable. But this is very useful when applying to flooding. These were some things that Jones County was actively doing to increase resilience. The FEMA buyout program is a very popular choice for people who are looking to relocate outside of the floodplain. They were building new EMS stations to expand capacity, and we did some analysis on that, and then updating those critical infrastructure like the government offices. They were making one of their old EMS stations that was a paid, and they were splitting it into 2. And so we did some analysis on what kind of zones those EMS stations could reach in different amounts of time. And so by doing this, they were able to reach the northeast part of their the northwest part of their county, and also the southern part of their county a little bit better. Meanwhile, they do have multiple volunteer stations that aren't pictured, but this was very useful to provide to their emergency services to show that they were expanding their capacity with this investment. I just wanted to summarize what we provide for Jones County. So we made understanding risk to hazard more accessible through the online maps. People could see where their property was and how exposed it was to certain to the flooding hazard. We also provided the GIS database for future downloads and easy updates. And then we quantified the risk and vulnerability, which they could use to provide for future funding. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Was there anything that really surprised you in this analysis?
I would say the most surprising thing was how unaware of people were about community members were about the details of the flooding risk. Considering many people had experienced multiple hurricanes in their lifetime, and then they still didn't quite understand the FEMA floodplain designations. I would say that was the most surprising, and being able to share this is something that was very valuable.
I didn't see public utilities. Was it something that just didn't make the list as far as a higher concern?
No, we didn't have access to that data. Like, they had just updated their water infrastructure, and that was all public utility, and they didn't have GIS data for it. So within the limitations of our 10-week program, we weren't able to generate that. But traditionally, in the RCCP handbook, that is something that's considered.
So I would say in eastern North Carolina, you get the benefit of pretty flat elevation, right?
Mm-hmm.
For your model, benefit for your model. So I guess if you want to make it more transferable, I would dive a little bit into that 250-meter distance, because outside of eastern North Carolina, you could have significant elevation changes in 250
Mm-hmm.
meters that not work so well. So I think it works fine in eastern North Carolina. Just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I assume they write this up.
Yeah, that came from a paper written by my mentor, Dr. Georgina Sanchez, and she had done it for the whole U.S. and she found that development was concentrated in that 250-meter buffer, and it was calling for extra regulations around that. So
Just to kind of snowball that, do you see any kind of limitations or problems using like the FEMA flood maps?
definitely, the 1% annual is not very conservative. So other countries like China use like a 5% flood map. So I think especially in with changing climate, changing strength of hurricanes, that may be too conservative of an estimate. But I think the way that it interacts with like legal stuff and zoning, I think using a government provided thing is very useful.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What are the next steps from your findings? Because we have done just something about hydrology, response, warnings, vegetables.
They had already had plans to dredge the river that runs through Jones County, and so we were hoping to provide this document to them so they could apply for funding for that or other projects. NC State and AmeriCorps will not be working with Jones County in the next summer. I think they will work with another county. But I'm no longer hired in this program, but my mentors were talking about continuing communication with them to support Jones County in other endeavors that they wanted to pursue.
Questions? I have a question for you. Can you go back to the slides when you show the page EMS?
Yes.
So I'm kind of a little bit surprised why. I'm sorry, I got stuck here. So why this area? This area looks
So-
different from this.
They were using the road data. A lot of this area is forests, like this is all national forest, and this is also a park as well.
Yeah,
and so,
but for in this map, this is a station, right?
yes.
And this area is within 10 miles of this station. But if oh, these are two different locations or the same
Yes,
location?
yes, that moved. This is also a new location.
I mean, these two maps shows the same study area, or not? The same study area, right?
Yes.
But so when there's a one, so it's within 10 miles. But when you add one more, it's further away. So this area, you see what I try to say?
Yes, I do.
But why that? So with it seems for this area, with one station, it's easier to get access to the station compared to with two stations. Why does that happen?
This was a model that I used in GIS.
So which means you add one more station and people have less access.
Yes, I'm actually not sure how to explain this. I haven't worked on it since last
Oh,
summer,
okay,
but
okay, gotcha. So you may want to look at what happened around this area in that
Mhm.
map. So is there a block?
it
area or
it could
something
just be
in
the
that?
way that the roads are and the way
Yeah.
that the model interacted with estimating how far you could travel in 10 miles. I'm really not sure.
Yeah, I think you may want to look at that area. Why there's like a cutoff
Mhm.
within away from further from 10 miles is 5 miles, 50 miles away.
I think if you look at, on the left one, when there's one station, that southeast part that looks like 2 points,
Up here,
yeah, the dark purple.
the dark purple.
Yeah, go down there. That dark purple matches the lighter purple on the other one. Like, you couldn't even get to the
Okay,
farther.
so that's where the station is.
Yeah,
The new
yep.
station is added here.
Yeah, I think it's part of the forest that's there.
Oh, okay,